Today would have been Anne Frank's birthday, and the diary that she wrote as a teenage girl while in hiding from the Nazis is one of the most read books in the world. Anne died in 1945 at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp just before it was liberated, but her words survived and continue to inspire. Good morning. I'm historian Edna Friedberg, and we are so fortunate to be joined by Holocaust survivor and museum volunteer Peter Feigl, who was also a teenager during the Holocaust. Thank you for being here, Peter.
Good morning, Edna, and thank you for asking me.
Like Anne, Peter also wrote about his life and loss while on the run from the Nazis. And today, Peter will share with us some of the experiences and reflections that he recorded in his own diaries. We invite you, viewers, to please ask questions of Peter in the chat, and we'll get to as many as possible in the course of the live show. So, Peter, let's start at your start. You were a young boy living in Germany when the Nazi government came into power in January 1933. Help us to understand what life was like for you during those early years of Nazi rule.
Well, my father, Ernst Feigl, was a graduate mechanical engineer. He was an Austrian citizen working in Germany. My mother essentially was taking care of me. I was an only child. And with my father, a professional person, life was very, very good. My father had a big convertible automobile. We summer times went on vacation either to the beach or to foreign countries like Switzerland or Austria. And life was very good. I really had no complaints. Of course, I don't remember much of my first 1-2 years, but I start remembering at age 4, 1933, when Hitler came to power.
And your family was not, although Jewish, was not particularly religious or observant, right?
You're absolutely right. My father wanted absolutely nothing to do with religion. He thought that he was 120% atheist, and I had absolutely no religious background whatsoever in my first 4 or 5 years of my life.
And your horizons, of course, as with any kid, expanded when you started school at age 6. Tell us a little about that, please.
Well, at age 6, you see me here carrying a big cone of candy, which is traditional in Germany on your first school day. And I was in a public school, and the teacher produced a book from which he started to read. There's the cover of the book, and it says on the cover their gift pills, which is the poison mushroom, and every child in Europe is warned never to touch that mushroom because it's very, very poisonous. And here it has a big, heavy Jewish nose. It's got a Star of David on its chest, and the teacher began to tell us that this signifies or represents what Jews are like. They are poisonous, they are bad people, they lie, they cheat, they steal, they molest children. I didn't know what that meant at that time, but anyhow, it must have been bad. And they told us, the teacher told us that Jews are just like vermin. They really needed to be exterminated. And this is something that was pounded into mine and all my classmates' heads. And I began to hate Jews. I had been taught to hate them.
Yeah, it only makes sense. And this is not something your teacher did on his own initiative. This book was in thousands of classrooms across Germany. Life became increasingly difficult for your parents and for all German Jews. And in 1936, your family left Berlin, eventually moving to Vienna, the capital city of Austria, which, as you said, was your father's home country. But there, hatred of Jews, anti-Semitism was also prevalent. So your parents made the decision to actually baptize you as a Catholic, hoping that doing so would protect you from anti-Jewish discrimination. And we have here this lovely photo of you. You look very proud for that day. But there was really no escaping that dark shadow. And in March 1938, Nazi Germany marched into Austria, annexing. Could you tell us from your own memories about a public celebration in which you joined at the time and how you came to understand that you were not actually part of this movement?
Well, 2 days after the annexation, Hitler was to come to Germany. The radio kept playing the same military marches, which I had heard back in Germany when I was 4 years old. And this sort of, I felt very much at home, and I wanted to see Hitler, and I ran away from home and went to in the vicinity of the city hall, and I stood there in a mob of people. There must have been several 100,000 people, all of them waving, holding their arms up, screaming, "Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer," one people, one empire, one leader. And I watched all the snazzy uniforms marching by, and the flags and the music. And then the Hitler Youth came by, and Hitler, of course, also, and I saw him coming by. But I really wanted to join the Hitler Youth, marching with the fife and drum corps and so on. And that uniform, that had a dagger that came with it. And boy, as a 9-year-old, I just wanted to get one of those uniforms.
You were out for hours, as you've recounted to us before. What happened when you finally came home?
Well, after nearly 4 hours away from home, my mother was waiting for me. She was furious and yelled at me and demanded to know where I was. And I said to her very proudly, "I saw our Führer." And mother slapped me left and right and said, "He is not our Führer, and don't you ever forget it." I was very confused at that time.
I mean, she must have been in a panic, not knowing where you were, and then to hear these own words coming out of her child. But of course, the crowd, the enthusiasm, it was designed to be contagious, and you absorbed it. Peter, I'm going to pause for a moment to greet viewers who we have and thank them for joining us from all around the country. We have people watching from Phoenix, Arizona, Gainesville, Florida, Minneapolis, Minnesota, and also a special welcome to the English 8 class at Colton Pierpont Central in Colton, New York. We're really glad to have you with us, students and adult learners alike. Peter, a viewer named Jin Flynn is asking whether we will be hearing some of the experiences from your diary. And in fact, we're going to jump ahead, I think, based on that, because I would like to get to your diary. And in fact, there are 2 of them, really extraordinary. Eventually, Peter and his family, he and his parents, fled to Belgium, just to give our viewers the context. And in May 1940, Germany invaded France, Belgium, and other countries in Western Europe. So the Feigl family was on the run again and ended up in Auch in France. Peter's parents sent him to a summer camp that was run by the Quaker religious movement to try to have him in a more out-of-the-way place to protect him from the dangers of war. Peter, could you tell us about the summer of 1942 while you were there, and what happened to your parents while you were being a camper?
Well, that summer I was at the summer camp located about 20 miles away from Auch, where my parents and I had lived. And I was very happy in that Quaker camp. There was good food, there were other kids, and there had been rumors circulating before then that Jews were being rounded up in Paris, but of course that didn't concern me. I was Catholic, and in the middle of August, totally unexpectedly, my father suddenly appeared. He had ridden a bicycle. I was very surprised to see him because he had developed heart trouble earlier in the French detention camp, and he came to give me a pouch and told me to keep this. And he said he only had a few minutes. He had to go back to Auch because there was a curfew. Jews were not allowed to be on the street after sundown. And we were on the crest of a hill. And as he disappeared from my view, I was suddenly overcome with a horrible feeling that I will never see my father again. And indeed, a few days later, on the 27th of August, the director of the summer camp where I was, Mrs. Cavaillon, a devout Catholic lady who took me to 7 o'clock mass with her every day, told me that my parents had been arrested the previous morning in Auch, but she said, "Don't worry about it. I'm going to organize a novena, and at the end of 9 days, I'm sure your parents will be returned to you." And it's on that day that I began writing my first diary. I dedicated the diary to my parents. After all, she told me they would be returned soon, and I wanted to record on a daily basis what was happening to me. And I had hoped that in a few days I would be seeing them again. I dedicated the diary to my parents and mentioned on there that I expect to hope that it will reach them both in good health, and began to record everything that was happening to me.
And if you could read, this is translated, but the words that you wrote, as you said, dedicating this diary to your parents.
Yes, this diary is written for my parents in the hope that it will reach them both in good health.
So it's almost like a letter from you, their only child. And I want to clarify, because you had said that you were Catholic, that even though you weren't raised affiliated with Jewish religious life in any way, and in fact were baptized Catholic, the French police came looking for you because under German law, and then by extension, French policy, you were considered Jewish on the basis of supposed biology. For the Germans, being Jewish had nothing to do with faith or religious belief or practice, but was supposedly racial. So you were still a target. So you've written your first diary entry, and that's why you're able to tell us with such precision when your parents were arrested the day after. Why did you decide to really start writing in this time?
I really, the only explanation that I have for it is that as an only child, I was very attached to my parents, and I wanted to record to them everything that I was doing, so that when I see them again, they would be able to read it, and they would know that I behaved just as they would have expected me to do so. I wanted to be a good boy and be rewarded for being so.
So it's really kind of cataloging your experiences with the expectation that you will share it with them when you
Yes.
are reunited. But despite Mrs. Cavaillon, the camp director, wanting to give you hope, to keep you going, months went by following your parents' arrest without any news or them returning. And you wrote in your diary about how much you miss them, about your hope for them to return. Could you please read an entry that you wrote in October 1942?
I think in October there I said something like, "How I would love to hear from you. If only the war would end soon. Not one aid organization knows where you went." And indeed, at that time, I didn't know. We were told that the people arrested by the French were being sent for, quote, resettlement in the East, for whatever that meant. So
I find myself thinking about my own teenage children. You know, we're so accustomed today to constant communication and constant information, and the idea that people could just vanish into a void. It's an overwhelming thing to imagine. Peter, I'll pause again just to thank. We also have international viewers tuning in all the way from Argentina, from Cuba, from Italy, from Wales, from the city of Campeche in Mexico, and from Brazil. We are so glad to have you with us to hear about Peter's life and his diary. So, Peter, you're 13 years old, 14 years old, you're without your parents, and Mrs. Cavaillon, as you've described, became your protector. She was acutely aware of the danger that you were in, and at some point even traveled with you to the French city of Marseille so that you could board a ship bound for the United States in late November. Could you please share with us some excerpts from the diary that you wrote at that time?
well, on November the 9th, I wrote, "The ship is to sail November 25." And then a few days later, on November the 11th, the English and Americans attacked North Africa. And then on November the 24th, after the Germans had occupied this Marseille, I wrote November 24, "Tomorrow is the day when the ship was to sail. Goodbye, ship." Because I said goodbye, ship, because the Germans, in occupying Marseille, stopped all ship traffic in and out of Marseille.
So we see day by day, week by week, your hopes, your plans, and then how they vanish, into thin air with goodbye ship and all ships. Soon after this, your opportunity to escape, as you said, vanished, and instead, the trajectory of your life changed when you were sent to a small French village called Le Chambon-sur-Lignon. Why were you sent there, and who was protecting you?
I was sent there when, in early January of 1943, rumors were circulating that Jews were about to be rounded up in Marseille, and the Quakers and other aid organizations, including Jewish Underground, uh, decided that I needed to be covered somewhere else, and I was sent to that village where I was told that I would be taken care of. And in my diary, I describe arriving there late at night, midnight on the 15th of January 1943, and I was met there by a young man named Daniel Trocmé, who it turned out was the director of the home where I would be sheltered, and he was responsible for protecting some 24 children under his care. Daniel Trocmé was related to the pastor of the village, André Trocmé. The unusual thing about the Chambon was that in predominantly Catholic country like France, this village and the immediate surrounding area, those were all Huguenots. They were all Protestants who back in the 16th century had been persecuted by the Catholics. And here's a picture of the children under Daniel's care. I'm sitting on the far left in the middle row. And the group was made up of kids. Some of them were like me, of German or the Austrian Jewish background. Some of them were children of refugees from the Spanish Civil War. There was a child from Czechoslovakia also. There was also a Frenchman there. We were an eclectic group, and in the middle, the tallest guy actually was a deserter from the German army. He was about 19 or 20 years old. So the villagers sheltered people who were in need and did so at their own great personal risk. What they were doing was prohibited by law. They could have been executed for taking care of people. And these were devout Protestants. The best way I can describe those people is by telling you there was a documentary made about the village, and there's an elderly lady shuffling towards her temple, and she has a Bible in the crook of her arm. And the film producer asked her, "But tell me, madame, why did you do this? This was against the law. You could have been executed for doing it." And she, in the most nonchalant way, taps the book and says, "It's in the book. It says here that if someone is hungry, you ask them to table and share what food you have. If someone needs shelter, you open your door and you bring shelter, you provide them with shelter. If someone is sick, you go to their bedside and you try to bring them cheer." So here were people who truly lived the Bible and did what the Bible told them to do. And interestingly enough, out of some 3,500 Jewish refugees that they saved, not one of them was arrested. And Daniel Trocmé, on the other hand, he was arrested. And 5,000 villagers saved some 5,000 refugees in total. And this is unique in the history of the Second World War, that so many at their own risk, without trying to enrich themselves, saved people whose lives were in danger.
And did it entirely based on compassion and faith. It's really, really extraordinary. I want to recognize that your rescuers, Mrs. Cavaillon, and then in Le Chambon, Daniel Trocmé, were among the people who were part of interlocking circles of trust, who sheltered you and saved your life. We would also like to welcome, who is watching with us today, a man named Pierre, who is the grandson of another rescuer from Le Chambon, Pastor Pierre Charles Touré. So hello, Pierre Touré. Glad to know that you are watching and that we can honor the bravery and sacrifice that your family made to save people like Peter Feigl. But at the time, Peter, actually, you could not be known as Peter Feigl, right? You were given a new name to hide your identity.
Yes, after Daniel Trocmé was arrested in late June of 1943, it became necessary to disperse the children there, and we were provided with a false identity. And I became Pierre Fesson with a nice French name, supposedly born in Auch in France. And if I should be asked where my parents were, the instructions were I was to say that my parents died in a bombing raid. And it's under this false identity that I and some other kids were sent to a high school, a boarding school in France, in a village called Figeac. And here too, there was at least one person who knew that we weren't genuine native Frenchmen, and he was the principal of the high school, the Collège Champollion, and he, at his own risk, also protected me and 4 other boys that came from the Chambon.
I want to turn back for a moment to Daniel Trocmé because he made the ultimate sacrifice. In fact, as you mentioned, he was arrested in late June 1943 after he rushed to protect the Jewish children in his care from Germans. And to the best of our knowledge, he was likely murdered in the Majdanek concentration camp. Your diary, from which you've been reading to us, ends abruptly on the 1st of February 1943, and after that, there are no more entries. And then at that point, it actually went missing. Do you have any idea now, looking back, what had happened to it?
Yeah,
why it went missing?
The last entry in that diary was February 1 and nothing else. And the reason, of course, was that at that time, Daniel saw me writing in the booklet, and he saw that it contained the names and addresses of a lot of people, and that would have been compromising and dangerous if my diary had fallen into the hands of the French police or the German Gestapo. So that he confiscated the diary, and it literally disappeared for the next 45 years. For many years, I began to wonder whether I had really written that first diary or not. But later on,
we'll get to it in a minute. I want to save that just to continue with our chronology, because as you mentioned, in January 1944, you were about to turn 15, and you had been sent to this boarding school in Figeac. At which point, you started a second diary, right?
Yes.
A viewer named Bonnie, and we're looking at a cover of your journal. A viewer named Bonnie is asking, Peter, at what point did you know that you would make it to safety, or if you ever did? What can you tell us about that?
I didn't really know of my making it to safety until the 22nd of May of 1944, which is the date when I set foot on the Swiss soil. Prior to this, in my diary, I described, for instance, how I was given instructions to get on a train. The diary describes where I was changing trains and so forth. I jumped off the train. I was met by some passeurs. Those are people smugglers. I was to follow their instructions, and they took me and a group of about 20 other kids towards the Swiss border. We didn't really know where they were taking us, but anyhow, they instructed us on how to cross the border, when to cross the border. It's all described in my diary. And at this signal, when the guards were being changed, I jumped or climbed over the first barbed wire fence, which was on the French side, ran through the no man's land, then climbed over the second barbed wire fence, which was on the Swiss side. And there behind that building was a Swiss soldier who arrested us. And we subsequently were taken to a triage center where the Swiss authorities were going to decide what to do with us. By the way, the sketch that I did in the diary, I sketched that shortly after I was on the safe side in Switzerland, because I now realized that I was in a free country in Switzerland, and I wanted to record what the layout was of the countryside, the land we crossed, and so forth. So in Geneva, we were being to be interrogated by Swiss police, and just before I was called in, someone warned me and said, "Be very careful what you say to the Swiss. They're sending Jews right back into the waiting hands of the French or German on the other side of the barbed wire fences." So during the interrogation, I pulled out my baptismal certificate, which I had on me. It actually had been sewn into the lining of my jacket. And when I showed that to the Swiss interrogator, he looked at it and said, "Ah, mais tu es catholique, bienvenue en Suisse. You're a Catholic, welcome to Switzerland." And at that moment that I knew that I was now safe and I had to stop running, the Swiss got in touch with the Swiss couple. My father, one of the men in the couple was a business associate of my father, and the couple decided to take me in. So at that point, I really knew that I was safe in Switzerland. I still, at this time, had no idea what had happened to my parents. I stopped making entries in my diary, by the way, and it wasn't until January of 1945 when first reports appeared in the Swiss newspapers about the Soviet troops having entered Auschwitz, the extermination camp, the Nazi camp in Poland. And there were photographs of it and long stories, and I read those avidly and came to the conclusion that since I hadn't heard anything from my parents, that most likely had been their fate. It wasn't until many years later, about 10, 15 years ago, that I learned at the Holocaust Museum that my father actually had survived. He was given a number, 63069, and he was assigned to somewhere in the camp where he was alive until the end of September 30, when there's an entry in a medical facility, and that's the end of him. My mother, unfortunately, was gassed immediately on arrival at Auschwitz. And it wasn't until many years beyond that. There's a picture of my mother and my father. You can see that my father was considerably older than my mother, 16 years older. But at that time also, I had no contact with any of my remaining family, my uncle, my aunt, and my grandmother. They were seeking me through the International Red Cross. They ultimately got sent a telegram to them asking where I was, and that's how I was reunited with them. My grandmother at that point, who had made it to New York sometime in the latter part of 1942, together with her other daughter, my aunt, they proceeded to try to get me an immigration visa and sponsor me. And ultimately, I succeeded to join them in the United States on the 15th of July, 1946, at which time I was 17 and a half years of age.
So what an ordeal. I mean, and also to think, I want us not to miss what you mentioned about going to Switzerland and being cautioned that you could have been turned back had you not been able to demonstrate that you had been baptized as Catholic, that your parents' protection actually endured and continued even after long separation and even after their death. And Peter, your story and your parents' sacrifice is really resonating. A viewer named Corey has written in to say, "I can't imagine the fear these people must have felt. What strong parents he must have had to raise such a resilient boy." So I wanted to make sure that you heard that.
Thank you.
Peter, of course, you've been reading to us from your first diary, which we knew had gone missing, but we have it somehow. So more than 40 years after the Holocaust, you found out that your first diary had in fact not been destroyed. How did you eventually get it back?
A series of coincidences gave me a brief appearance in a documentary about the village of Le Chambon. When that movie was shown in French theaters, a few days later, I received a letter from a man in Paris, Mr. Diamant, asking whether I was the Pierre Feigl who had dedicated a diary to his parents. I went to see the man in Paris, and sure enough, he had it. So how did you get my diary? And he told me that he was a collector of such memorabilia. He purchased it on a flea market. And by the way, he published it in France also. I wanted my diary back. He told me that he had spent money having it published. And ultimately, I wound up paying him $265 to get my diary back. And that's how I got it back into my possession. Both of my diaries I have translated into English and donated them to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C.
Thank you, and we are honored to be their caretakers, although I have to admit it grates on me to know that you had to pay to retrieve what was rightfully yours. We're looking at a very special page, very meaningful, with the photos of your parents pasted there because during the war, those were the only two photos that you had of them, right?
Yes, those were the only ones I had at that time.
Peter, later in the 1990s, you said that although you had previously assumed that your parents had died, you were able to confirm more what had happened to them. And I think that also shows the power of having these kinds of documents, whether official ones like camp documents or your diary, which is its own, firsthand primary source narrative day by day. And in fact, is corroborated by many things we know from other eyewitnesses, from other survivors, and from news reports. So they are all interlocking pieces that help us to reconstruct this period of time. Peter, there's a question. A viewer named Azita says it's amazing that you had your diaries all these years and wants to know if you still keep a journal.
No, I stopped writing diaries back then when I was in Switzerland, safe in Switzerland. That was the end of my diaries.
Well, we know that the diaries, as you described, you wrote them with the intended audience being your mother and father. And it is, no word I could use would be adequate to describe what it means that you were not able to share it with them. But we are very grateful that you have shared them with us. That you have worked with us at the museum to help to translate them, because of course translation is an art and not a science. It's not just the language to language translation, but understanding your intention behind the words. And your words help us to much better understand what life was like for you as a young boy, trying to stay one step ahead of the Nazis during the Holocaust and of their French collaborators. So thank you, Peter. We are so fortunate to speak with you and to learn from you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the audience for listening to an old man. Thank you very much.
A few more comments for you to hear, Peter. Claire writes to say, I highly commend those who risked all to support and guide you to freedom. And we could not agree more. I know that Peter hopes that we will all learn more about the brave people of Le Chambon, read about them, watch movies about them. Another viewer named Yael has asked if Peter's diaries were published, that she wants to read them. And yes, Yael, you can actually read translations of them and look at photos and scanned images of them. Zoom in close on Peter's great handwriting on the museum's website, and we will post links to that in the comments section for you and also another person named Aditi who wanted to know. So we hope this just invites you to learn more about Peter and the brave people who shared the responsibility for saving his life. I also want to just say that there are many other such diaries. And of course, we are marking Anne Frank's birthday today, but she is the best known. It doesn't mean that she is the only one or that there isn't something deeply, deeply profound in all of these others. So we hope that this will help you to think about this time in history in a different way and to understand all of the elements that led to survival or not. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.